Hello and welcome to this morning's Institute for Government webinar. I'm Emma Norris. After weeks of speculation and many rounds of interviews, we now know the identity of the new Cabinet Secretary. It's Sir Chris Wormald. But who is Chris Wormald? Well, he is, as has been noted, perhaps both the conventional pick and also the surprise choice for the country's top civil servant. Because Keir Starmer has chosen Wormald to help him lead a complete rewiring of the British state, which to some people perhaps doesn't sound like the task for a career civil servant who served as permanent secretary at the Department for Education and now the Department of Health. But to others, it's Wormald's deep experience of the civil service which makes him exactly what Starmer needs at a time when his relatively new ministers are still getting to grips with the challenges of government. So let's take a look at what Wormald brings to the job, what's waiting in his in tray, how exactly he could go about that big rewiring job, and what steps he can take to ensure that the civil service is able to deliver Keir Starmer's priorities. Joining me to discuss all of these questions and more, and please do send in your questions anytime from now, are a duo of top IFG civil service watchers, Alex Thomas and Kath Haddon. And we're also joined today by Sir David Lidington, former Minister for the Cabinet Office and somebody who has lots of first-hand experience of how government works or sometimes doesn't work. So, David, I'm going to come to you first. Tell us your reaction to the appointment.
Thanks. Chris Wormald is not somebody I claim to know particularly well, but I think he's clearly a very experienced civil servant. He will have a decent start in the fact he has been a permanent secretary, the head of a government department for a number of years, means that he will be seen by his peer group as somebody with experience with weight. I think one of the problems that Simon Case had throughout his tenure has been that he was not a permanent secretary before he became cabinet secretary, and therefore the barons around the table amongst the departmental permanent secretaries, I think, were less inclined than they might have been to accept his authority as a given. I think that would be different with Chris Wormald, but I think he faces massive challenges. Not least of the fact is that although it's only 6 months since the general election, this government has not got much time to actually start to implement the major reforms that it is talking about to the public sector and have some results, not just pain, to show to the public by the time the next election comes round. 6 months in, by the time we get to, I don't know, sometime in 2027, it will be in the mood, people will be in the mood in Parliament. Labour MPs will be saying, oh, we mustn't announce anything too controversial. We can't launch new initiatives. We'll get all the bad news and it's too close to the election to take risks. So actually, there's 2 years that they've got. And if they need legislation, that will take a year to take that through Parliament. So Chris Wormald's got to really get a grip on the challenges of implementation, both at the centre of government, where my own view for a long time has been that the centre of government isn't working anything like as effective as it needs to do, but also in trying to sort out some of the problems that there are in significant spending departments, his own previous bailiwick of health, in defence, and in other places where the system would be seen by politicians, both Labour and Conservative, as not being sufficiently responsive, not being energetic enough to deliver the answers that they're wanting.
And David, you said you hadn't worked an awful lot with Chris in government, but tell us when you did come across him and when you did, are you convinced that he is somebody who's able to do what you say, able to, grasp the nettle quickly to get things done, focus on implementation in the next couple of years?
Well, I think it's striking that successive health secretaries who work for him speak very highly of him. And he's not somebody I've heard bad mouth around the system. I suppose my question would be whether the health service, the NHS, are delivering as well as the public and the present cabinet want them to deliver. Wes Streeting has talked about the need for far-reaching reform in the health service, and I think there is an impatience I detect in the new Labour government, as well as amongst Conservative politicians, over the fact that for many public spending settlements now, the health service has had money over and above what other departments have been given. And on a number of occasions, NHS bosses said, yeah, this is what we need to really sort out the problems and take the NHS forward. And then, 2 years down the line, oh, they're running out of money again. The waiting lists haven't come down. The best performing trusts don't seem to have shared, or their best practice has not been copied by the less well performing NHS trusts elsewhere in the country. And so I think there may be some question marks about whether Chris Wormald has really gripped some of the difficulties that Wes Streeting will have when he tries to take on, take any NHS reform through, even from a Labour secretary state, will start off with more goodwill than the Tory one would do. He's going to start off with the different tribes amongst the NHS professions, all being rather suspicious of his motives and all concerned that their bit of the NHS might be losing out.
Alex, David's alluded to the kind of the scale of the task, how much Labour want to get on with reform. Starmer said that his government's kind of mission agenda is going to require a total rewiring of the British state. What does that mean for Wormald's job, and how well suited is Wormald to taking on that kind of task?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Just rewire the state for me, would you? Just crack on. It's a huge thing to say, and it's we of all people will go on about how important the cabinet secretary and head of the civil service job is, and it is really important and is central to all these different aspects of good government. But equally, in the end, it's on Keir Starmer to rewire the state if that's what he really wants to do. So I suppose there's that little bit of context, and it's down to Chris Wormald to help him. I mean, but to that point, and picking up on some of the themes that David touched on, I think what does rewiring the state mean? Well, it seems clear to me that in Keir Starmer's mind, when choosing Chris Wormald, was the performance and reform and improvement of public services. If he sees the performance of the health service in particular, but public services more generally, as crucial to the re-election of a Labour government, to the achievement of the things that they want to get done, then he looks at the candidates in front of him and thinks, well, who has the experience, the CV to make those changes? For all the controversy that attends around COVID and the health service and some of the failure to reform that David talked about in the health service, I suppose you go, well, Chris Wormald has that CV. And on the rewiring point, that needs to sit alongside, again, as David talked about, some pretty comprehensive changes to the centre of government, the way the Cabinet Office works, the way it's able to give direction, the way that Starmer and Pat McFadden work to sort of organise, manage, get a grip on the system of the missions that they've said are central. It is interesting that the Wormald appointment is coming out in the same week that the government will talk about its priorities for change. Something we've argued for a long time, that governments need to translate their manifesto into a tangible set of priorities that kind of act as a way to set direction for governing as well as for campaigning. So I think the interesting thing about Wormald, in contrast to some of the other candidates who are out there, is that it suggests that Starmer really wants to take that public service improvement very, very seriously. It does leave gaps. We'll no doubt go into this later on in the webinar, but less Treasury experience, and Chris will need to dive right into the Treasury and make sure that his presence is felt there straight away. Less national security and foreign policy experience. It's a big bad world out there at the moment, and he will need to establish himself in that sphere as well. But it suggests that his focus in terms of rewiring is going to be on public services.
And let's just stick with public services for a moment. As you say, Chris has been in health for some time. He also has a background in schools and took on some of the really meaty schools reform, didn't he, Alex?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Again, it's controversial. Different people have different views about it, but there is a bit of a sense, and we've heard it. You hear it. You hear it from talking to people about current Labour ministers thinking, well, what did the last 14 years of Conservative government get right, and where were there ministers who had kind of agency and activity? Obviously, David Lidington was one of them, but they often look to Michael Gove and the schools reforms to say whether you agree or disagree with them. Gove had a way of kind of bringing the system together, galvanising the system to his policy objectives, and Chris Wormald was a close, worked very closely with him from 2012 onwards, in education. So you could see part of the pitch to Starmer will be, I know how to get things done. I know how to make the system work. What is interesting though, and this goes to the sort of some of the ambiguities around the job, is if you're the permanent secretary of the Department for Education, actually you do run a lot of schools, but in the end the change's done through the schools. If you're the permanent secretary in the Department of Health and Social Care, I always think, I worked there briefly, that DHSC is sort of stuck between number 10 and the Treasury on the one hand and this enormous NHS England on the other. And so what actually is your power? How do you transact what your Secretary of State wants to do? And clearly Chris Wormald has survived and thrived in that environment. So yeah, interesting reform, but not uncontroversial. And again, we'll probably come back to this, but the COVID inquiry is still ongoing. We're about to get a Module 2 report, which will probably be critical of DHSC and possibly Wormald in particular, the rhythm for the next few years, probably throughout his time at Cabinet Secretary. He's going to be popping up at the COVID inquiry, giving evidence on all sorts of modules. So that, again, that will be a fairly sort of forensic analysis of his performance in that job.
And Alex, I just want to stick with civil service reform for a moment. How can Chris Wormald work with Starmer to change the way that the civil service works? And I suppose I'm thinking particularly of changes to the centre, which we've made a lot of arguments for. Also, the spending review is coming up. Next June we're expecting it. What might his role be there?
He's got to really dive into it. I think he's got to be. Again, cabinet, so you can't be in the detail the whole time because it's an impossible job. So you can't be completely on point for every single decision or every single conversation. But he needs to assert his authority over the Treasury and over the centre of government. He needs to be involved in the relevant appointments. He needs to be sort of on top of all the processes. On civil service reform more generally, I mean, I foresee, we've talked about this in previous podcasts and events, but I can see a moment in the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, who knows exactly when it will come, when Labour ministers collectively will get quite frustrated with the system. Is it delivering for them? Is it going fast enough, hard enough? And Wormald will have to he'll have to do quite a difficult trick of putting himself on the side of the civil service and being a spokesperson for the civil service, being the voice of the civil service, leading 500,000 civil servants and having their confidence, giving them confidence and authority, while also putting himself on the side of the Prime Minister, who at some point will be saying, why am I saying these things and they're not happening? Why have we set out our objectives and they haven't kind of got purchase on the system? So in terms of how he goes about reform, he needs to both be the sort of representative of the civil service and a kind of restless reformer who is saying to the Prime Minister and other senior ministers, I'm on your side. I'm going to galvanise the system to get stuff done.
And Kath, I want to kind of stick with this relationship with the top ministers. As Alex said, the Cabinet Secretary has to convince the Prime Minister, I'm on your side. Those relationships with the Prime Minister, with other senior ministers, are amongst the most important that the Cabinet Secretary has. What's the best way for the new Cabinet Secretary to approach building those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first instance, as Alex has been saying, it's going to be gripping the centre. We've seen throughout the first 5 months of this government that they have struggled. We've already had a reset. In a sense, this is another reset. We've lost a minister, mini reshuffle following that. Lots of criticism still being thrown at number 10 for how they're gripping the agenda and getting messages out there and so forth. And a lot of that is going to be crucial in the next few months of the spending review. As Alex said, getting into the Treasury on that front. The Prime Minister can't just trust to the good relationship with the Chancellor. They need to have their own sources of advice. But to be honest, I mean, this comes to the heart of the tension. Wormald will want to be and will need to be the person that the Prime Minister reaches for when they've got a problem, being in the room for those all-important conversations. That's former Cabinet Secretaries always say, that's how you build the trust that allows you to do the other half of the job, which is pushing back when needed to be, driving system change, leading the civil service as a whole, gaining that confidence and so forth. And so if the role is going to continue as it does, doing both sides of those jobs, then he's got to prove that he's able to do both sides of that. And the risk is that you do just get drawn into those kind of all-important meetings. There's always firefighting. There's always absolutely chock-a-block all day long important meetings that you can be at. So at some point, he's also going to have to think about how to prioritize that. And having been a permanent secretary at two big departments with some hefty stuff on, he should have good experience for that. But obviously, it's a different matter once you're in the centre. Again, he's got experience of being in the centre, so he's seen that happen. But that, I think, is going to be a big challenge for him. Can he build that confidence whilst also being a disruptor and somebody challenging them, but also challenging the system? And it's a really difficult line to tread.
And Kath, you've been watching Whitehall for a long, long time now. You've seen lots of different cabinet secretaries in action. What have you learnt about when and how cabinet secretaries genuinely add to making government more effective?
I think it is those all-important interventions. When a problem this is always what people praise Jeremy Hayward for. When a problem seems intractable, it's working out that actually there's another solution, another way through all of this. It's bringing the different bits of the system together so that actually it doesn't feel like you're losing control and it's incoherent, and sort of providing that oomph to the centre that what is quite an underpowered centre when you look at other countries, still feels like it's got the ability to reach around the system. And another thing that's incredibly important is carrying the rest of the organisation with you. And I mean, in particular, the other leaders, the permanent secretaries, because we have a system of government where a lot of power can be diffuse. Permanent secretaries answered their Secretary of State in the first instance, answer to. Whitehall departments are their own centres of power. And so there's lots of ways in which permanent secretaries can push back and can try and avoid that sort of central pull. And that leadership from the top, from the cabinet secretary, is something that we, by and large, rely on personalities to solve. We don't have, incredibly strong sort of management functions that create a very corporate atmosphere. The atmosphere has to come from a team of people working together. So creating that feeling of, a cohort of leadership amongst the permanent secretaries, making sure that when they're getting together, they are communicating well, having worthwhile meetings, that it's a good use of their time to get together. All of that stuff's going to be incredibly important, because the things that Alex is talking about aren't things that the cabinet secretary can do alone. He needs the rest of Whitehall to come with him to do it.
And Kath, at least some people were hoping that this would be our first female cabinet secretary. It's not. Should we be concerned that we haven't yet had a female cabinet secretary in all this time? And do you think it will ever happen?
It will happen. Yes, absolutely. Well, as long as we continue to have the role of cabinet secretary. But yeah, look, of course, it's a bit of a frustration. We've seen, the first female chancellor with this government. But of course, we want to see it as an appointment on merit. This is an appointment that epitomises the civil service, and the civil service, its core being is about appointment on merit. So it needs to be where you have a really good female candidate who comes through. And one of the positives of this time is we have seen some very strong female candidates, visibly at the top of this competition. That's great progress for future candidates. They definitely can feel that they are in the mix. You look back at past competitions, that absolutely did not happen. But there will be a lot of women in the civil service who are frustrated with this. I did research a few years ago looking at women in Whitehall and how they progress, and the sort of role models of where you see people getting promoted and getting the job and why you think they got the job. It does make a difference to people. So when you feel like you've got to work, twice as hard to even be seen as half as good as the male candidates, that is incredibly frustrating. So I mean, the heart of this is that this is now Wormald's problem to fix. He has got a lot of good female candidates out there. How is he going to start thinking about his successor, about building the cohort of permanent secretaries? We will see permanent secretaries, depart and come through on his watch. How is he helping to build the platform for future cabinet secretaries to come for. We have had a female deputy cabinet secretary in the past, Helen McNamara. That role in itself was a bit of an innovation. It'd be interesting to see whether Wormald thinks that, you know, to tackle some of the gaps in his own experience, he wants to go for a different model of how he acts as a cabinet secretary, but we'll have to wait and see on that front. So yeah, it's kind of Chris Wormald's problem to now be thinking about, to be working with his fellow cabinet secretaries, fellow permanent secretaries on. But I think it is still progress through this competition, even if it's not led to a woman cabinet secretary at this point.
Thanks, Kath. David, I wanted to come back to something that both Kath and Alex have talked about, which is the kind of careful balancing act that a cabinet secretary has to kind of take on, both being one of the kind of closest advisors to the Prime Minister, but also being willing to challenge where necessary, to defend the civil service and speak out. Where do you think that balance lies in operating behind the scenes or speaking out, giving speeches, presenting the civil service's case?
I think that the relationship between the Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretary it's very difficult to understate how important this is, to overstate how important this is. That Chris Wormald is going to be in the morning meeting, 8:30, whenever Keir Starmer has it, with a handful of other people, a couple of senior ministers, I imagine Pat McFadden and Angela Rayner. They're the PM's own number 10 top team. And the cabinet secretary will be there in the confidence of the Prime Minister. And a Prime Minister, if they're sensible, will expect the cabinet secretary to give them candid, unvarnished advice to find a way of solving the problem given the decision that the Prime Minister wants to take on a subject. Whether the cabinet secretary has agreed with that decision or not in private, his duty is to go away and find an answer to deliver the course that the Prime Minister wants to take. But 100% loyalty outside the meeting. I think one of the challenges in the sort of new environment in which we operate is that there is an expectation that senior government officials speak more in public, are more visible in public than used to be the case previously. You've got the chiefs of the intelligence services, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, who make occasional, pretty high-profile public interventions. And I think part of the job for Chris Wormald is going to be to speak about the role of the civil service. I think it'd be important for the civil servants to feel that their boss, the head of the civil service, has got their backs as a profession. And when they come under attack, as they will from time to time in the press and in Parliament, not over particular policies, human beings mess up, in all walks of life from time to time, but over the institution being under attack, then it'll be the duty of the boss to go out and say that it's a good thing that we have an independent civil service that is able to serve whichever government of whichever political party the electorate gives them, and to defend the conventions under which the civil service operates and its duty to give candid advice to ministers before they take a decision, even if that's advice sometimes that ministers don't want to hear.
Emma, just quickly, can I jump in on that, because it's related to a point David was saying on the. I think that it's an interesting appointment in all sorts of ways, but one of the interesting things just in the last 24 hours is the reaction to the appointment, which is quite sort of muted. I think had it been a bigger figure, an Ollie Robbins or an Antonio Romeo, who's a more public figure rather than bigger figure, I think we would have seen a slightly different kind of public press media reaction to this. So I do wonder if in the short term, and I suspect this is what Chris Wormald will want, the job becomes less high profile, less prominent, and more private. And I suspect Starmer and Wormald will be kind of interested in that in that happening. And we've sort of seen that a little bit in the relatively limited coverage just this morning around the appointment. But it's a big but, and I think this will be a challenge for Chris Wormald. I don't think that's sustainable. I think over time, exactly as David says, interest picks up. The job is now a public job. The civil service is rightly the matter of public scrutiny and public interest and parliamentary scrutiny and interest. And so Wormald will have to be able to occupy that space by making the occasional speech or through his appearances in front of parliamentary committees and others in sort of telling that story around the civil service and being a voice for the institution of the civil service, while obviously not overstepping the line in terms of commenting on government policies or anything else. So I think there's a sort of short-term, lower profile, but long-term, the trend is clear that this is a public job and needs to be kind of recognised as such.
But do you agree, Alex, also that part of that public-facing role has got to be saying in public to the civil service that some changes need to take place, whether it's a Labour government, a Conservative government, or whoever. For example, artificial intelligence is going to play an increasing role. You can see ministers already saying that they place a lot of faith in the ability of AI to deliver not only a better service to the public, but to do so in a way that makes the budget stretch further, and cutting some of the costs. Now that, to bring that about, to make use of data in the way that Dominic Cummings and others have argued in the recent past, is going to require quite far-reaching changes to the way in which the civil service has often operated up till now. And it'll be part of the job of the boss to explain to the civil service, most of whom don't work in Whitehall, after all. Most of them work out of London. You talk about people down in benefit offices, as well as people in government-funded agencies like the NHS or the regulatory bodies. That change has got to happen, and that change should be embraced rather than seen as a threat to them.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, completely agree with that. And I think that is the kind of the capability building that he needs to do, and he needs to put himself on the side of change, and to do that in a way that is credible in civil service terms, but also, also potentially quite radical. AI is not a panacea, but it will change the way that the world works. There are also dangers in terms of, in terms of how far and how fast you go on that. So yeah, he needs to be able to present that public narrative. I mean, I would do, this is not a particularly novel idea, but I would do what Gus O'Donnell did, which is institute a series of capability reviews of departments. Doesn't need to be Kath smiling. It's a classic go-to, but it worked. It was pretty good. It doesn't need to be a kind of lengthy exercise, but a fairly kind of rapid. What's the state of the civil service at the moment? Where are the strengths? Where are the weaknesses? Where are the different capabilities? Kind of go through that and use that as a platform for improvement and government reform. Kath wants to come in.
Yeah, no, I'm smiling because I love me a capability review. I'm definitely on the side of bringing them back. I've also got some good research up my sleeve from the last round of capability reviews. I just want to touch on another aspect of the public part of the role, because I think this is both the challenge for the government, but also the challenge for Wormald. I mean, we've already talked about the COVID inquiries and the COVID inquiry, and obviously Wormald is going to keep coming up, and our colleague Jill Rutter has emphasised that is going to be a huge risk for them, both in the reports that come out, but also in future evidence. But another side of that was also how Wormald approached the evidence-giving session on that, and he will be in front of liaison committees, select committees, in front of PACAP, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, to give it its full title. So he's going to be in front of select committees, and they don't like the kind of approach that is very much trying to sort of dampen everything down and not give any answers, and the sort of civil service speak and so forth. So on the one hand, Wormald is going to have to think about how he approaches those particular moments that can enrage not only parliamentarians, but also the public. It's then when you see the sort of the critical comments, perhaps in a little bubble on social media, but certainly it seems to have some kind of cut through when they see, officials not really answering the question or not really engaging with it. So thinking about those responses. But there's another side of that, which is that we've seen many cabinet secretaries become sort of lightning rod for the government expressing its own, frustration as a way to sort of slightly shift it to one side. And I think in recent years under the Johnson government, that got particularly toxic. But we've seen it in other eras. Richard Wilson certainly got a lot of bad briefing about him. So I think Wormald also needs to be aware of and prepared for those moments where he becomes a lightning rod for the government to be sort of, pushing the blame onto others if they're starting to feel frustration and so forth. Because my worry is that you get into this toxic loop that just decreases public trust in everyone. And it might seem like a good opportunity, sort of getting a few headlines and so forth, but it doesn't instill trust in government as a whole. So I think both of them thinking not just about how can they actually make the change, but also when things do go wrong, and they will go wrong, how can they avoid getting into that toxic loop that just basically is damaging for all concerned? That would be a nice change to see.
Alex, I want to just stick on the kind of question of reform and the Cabinet Secretary's role there. I think there's quite a lot of agreement that one of the ways to make changes to the civil service itself is to bring in a greater kind of array of people, particularly from outside the civil service and at the top. What's the role of the Cabinet Secretary in bringing in some of that reform, trying to ensure there are more external candidates coming into top jobs in the civil service?
Yeah, I said this bit in a thing I wrote last night about the appointment. The sort of the consummate insider needs to recognise the value of bringing people in from outside, and it's almost it's more important if you're a person of the system, that you're challenged and tested and bringing people with views that are different and who might have a different approach. I think sometimes this debate can be a bit kind of crudely caricatured about just bringing people from the private sector because they understand the value of money and efficiency and so on. And there is there's a clarity of accountability in the private sector that can be quite useful, but also, and particularly with this government, people from the third sector, charities, local government, the kind of wider public sector, as well as the private sector, have a lot to offer from government. And actually, Wormald, in one sense, is well placed to tap into that sphere of talent. So the Cabinet Secretary, as head of the civil service, has a really big role to play in creating those conditions. Firstly, in the tone that they set, what they say they want to happen, how they kind of comport themselves, and the messages they send out to permanent secretaries and the whole rest of the civil service. In all my time in the civil service, you would hear the signals that the Cabinet Secretary sent out, and if you knew what was good for you, you'd kind of respond to them. So there's a tonal thing that matters, and then there's also the sort of HR procedural side of it. So I mean, the civil service can get pretty gummed down in human resources processes quite a lot of the time, and that's one of the things that puts external people off sometimes. But cutting through quite a lot of that, saying actually no, we are going to create roles that don't have an enormous management span, so maybe academic experts or other kind of deep specialists can come in and do that. Some really kind of basic stuff. The civil service already theoretically advertises most senior roles externally by default, but then puts them in a kind of incomprehensible format or a job description that only makes sense to insiders. Some of the recruitment practices around strengths-based and competency-based recruitment need a civil service knack to get through the system. So one of the things I think that the Cabinet Secretary, as the leader of the civil service, will need to do is kind of cut through some of that guff, if you like, and set a very clear tone, but also have a management system for the civil service that allows him to, with advice from other permanent secretaries, but to take decisions about these kind of corporate civil service issues. One of the things we talk about quite a lot is actually how, and Kath touched on this, how limited the authority of the Cabinet Secretary is in taking kind of corporate management decisions around the civil service. No one really runs the civil service. Is Chris Wormald going to be able to use his authority to do that, or will it all be kind of softly persuasion stuff? So some slightly more kind of betraying my centralizing instincts on some of these things, but some slightly kind of tighter decisions about recruitment practices and things will help get more external people in, I think.
David, the other bit of the reform debate that keeps rumbling on, partly because IFG keep talking about it, is splitting the role of cabinet secretary. Do you think that that's ever going to happen?
I think it'll depend on the appetite of the Prime Minister of the day for doing that. I mean, it's one of these classic things, but there's a case either way. You can say that the current job, the Cabinet Secretary, head of the civil service, is just too much for any single man or woman to take on. Therefore, split it. On the other hand, actually, have the CabSec who is in charge of finding solutions to implement the policies that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have agreed upon. Also to be the man who is or the woman ultimately in charge of the civil service who have got the job of delivering it. I mean, there's a logic in having those two roles fused in the one office. So it's not something I take a theological position over. I think actually it's the practical challenges that he's going to face. I think one of the things I think is a potential weakness for this government is that, in a way that's rather surprised me, they appear to have their policy priorities dominated very much by the Treasury. And we have seen that in the way that so far, for example, mission boards have been downgraded compared with what our expectations were when the current government came to office. And I think that actually one of the tasks for the new Cabinet Secretary is going to be to try to inject life into these cross-departmental missions, which, because they will require action from more than one department and money from more than one department, really have to be driven by centre of government in some way. So can Chris Wormald find a way to persuade Rachel Reeves and her department to actually make the setting of spending priorities in the forthcoming spending review something that is more collegiate than the purely bilateral process of Treasury going from one department, then the second department, then the third department in turn, ticking them off a list, which is how it's been in the past. There's never normally been even a collective cabinet discussion about whether they want, for example, extra destroyers or extra prisons. There's no occasion when every cabinet minister's hand is dipped in the blood of spending priorities. And we don't have a system where the allocation of money is clearly linked to the setting of policy priorities and the drafting of implementation plans. And that seems to me is a huge missing element in how we do government in this country. I mean, I think Pat McFadden is committed to trying to get something along the lines of what I've just described. And that was implicit in everything Keir Starmer said in the run-up to the general election. Now, will Chris Wormald be able to help him deliver that? I think that's one of the massive questions that we need to see answered.
And one of the big questions that IFG is working on when we talk about reform to the spending review to achieve exactly that. Kath, I've got a couple of questions coming in that I want to go to you on. We've talked a bit about the COVID inquiry already, the evidence that Wormald's already given. As I think Alex has already mentioned, it's likely that Chris Wormald's going to be called up to the COVID inquiry again. Is there a risk that he's going to become the story in continuing to play this role in the inquiry, particularly at some really high-profile moments? And could that be a distraction from his role in getting on working with Keir Starmer to improve government?
Yeah, I think self-evidently yes, on both counts. I mean, the real question is, and only Wormald will know this, and even he may not fully, is what else is to come. So, there's three potential points of where Wormald might become the story. One is obviously, further phases of the inquiry go on, new evidence coming out. We've already seen some WhatsApps that involve Chris Wormald. The other is obviously further evidence sessions, which, we've discussed this. Those are a moment where, you do not control what you're being asked. You may be able to control what you're answering, but even that can cause huge frustration. And we know that some of the families of victims of COVID have already come out quite strongly about this appointment. And then the final bit is obviously the conclusions that Baroness Hale comes out with, and if some of those are particularly focused on Chris Wormald and his role at the Department of Health, that is going to be very damaging. You would think that this has been part of the consideration. So it is something that the Prime Minister has talked to Chris Wormald about, or that they have decided that, that's an acceptable course of action. And the truth is, obviously, any of the internal candidates will be accountable for policies and areas that were on their watch, and some of those would be around COVID. So probably for most of the cohort, their previous history and working and so forth is something that's going to be a risk. I think it's particularly important in terms of the progress of this inquiry that the government keeps giving reassurance, not only to the inquiry, but also to those involved, that, this doesn't change anything, that Wormald will be appearing and held to account, and the government will be as transparent as it ever was, and nothing has changed in terms of how the inquiry is being dealt with. So trying to build up that sense of public trust that this is a perfectly normal process for an inquiry to look into how things happened, and that lessons need to be learned, and that they're fully behind that, and that this hasn't changed anything. I think that's a really important message for them to send out.
Kath, I've got a history question that you're going to enjoy. So Chris Wormald comes into a role that clearly has quite a long history. Which of his predecessors do you think he is most like?
Oh,
Which do
God.
you think he should adopt as a model for the challenges he's facing today? David, Alex, I might ask you to answer this question too, so you can put your
Well, I
thinking
know Alex
on.
is going to go for Jeremy Hayward, but even though he says that, Wormald is very different from that,
Not necessarily.
I'm going to go with a little bit. He needs a little bit of Gus O'Donnell with a bit of Jeremy Hayward, because obviously Hayward was very good at that incisive kind of solve the problem, see solutions that nobody else had saw, and so forth. Alex can do a better job of discussing Hayward's legacy. But I think O'Donnell had the systems leadership, or at least, look, views will differ, but he is the person that brought in capability reviews. Again, big fan. He put a focus on that. The difficulty is, like, you want to be your own person. Times have changed massively. We've just talked about AI and the other tech challenges that the government face. With, the Prime Minister talked about a rewiring of the state. So you don't want them to be like any of the past cabinet secretaries. That's my easy way out of it. But if you really push me, a little bit of O'Donnell, a little bit of Hayward, I don't know. A little bit of Deputy Cabinet Secretary Helen McNamara as well. Just put that one out there as well.
Are we all going to get a go at this one, Emma? That's the.
You can have a go, Alex. Go on.
I'll well, my way of not answering it, but I will come back to an answer in a second, is to come at it from a slightly different direction. Who will be Chris Wormald's Jeremy Hayward? So if Chris Wormald is Gus O'Donnell, one of the reasons why Gus O'Donnell could take a kind of broader view, be a system leader, kind of come in at the critical moments, but not have to be in the room for every single decision, was because Jeremy Hayward was there in number 10, often not the whole time, but often as Principal Private Secretary, or as Permanent Secretary in number 10. So that's a way in to the question that we have sort of touched on, but who will Wormald appoint to some of these critical jobs? What will the merry-go-round of permanent secretaries that will now follow? I mean, there's a vacancy at Health, clearly, but we would expect other permanent secretaries to go, either because they wanted to be cabinet secretary and now aren't, or because they stayed on to see through the transition or whatever. So how will number 10? There's the competition for the Principal Private Secretary at number 10 has just closed. Wormald will want to insert himself into that competition. So how will he set up the rest of the system so that he can do that bit of O'Donnell, bit of Hayward? If we're really talking about rewiring the system, then my fun answer would be he needs to be Maurice Hankey, because he was the first cabinet secretary, and we've got and this is actually about kind of setting up a new system, defining the job in a way that is suitable for a new age. So if we take Keir Starmer at his word, then it's Hankey that we need. But Kath can keep you right on that.
Only that Maurice Hankey did that by creating a very good power base for himself and somewhat usurping the role of minister. But and not that I'm not a fan, but he was a very good political operator. But David Lidington, I'm sure, will have his own thoughts.
Well, I'm like Alex. I'm going to cheat a bit, but I mean, constitutionally, of course, the cabinet is a subcommittee of the Privy Council. So I'm going to go further back. I mean, that the role model I have in mind is one of my sort of heroes, is William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was appointed secretary of the Privy Council when Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, and who died still in a position of great power in 1598, 40 years later, remained at the top of politics administration throughout that time, and then actually installed his son to succeed him eventually as Secretary of the Privy Council. I'm not attributing any of that sort of ambition to Chris Wormald, but I think actually that if you look further back, there are some lessons that apply today, which are just incredible appetite for work. You know, you find Burleigh's finger in every pie when you look at Elizabeth's government and the different parts of it, the state papers of that period, the treasury documents of that period. He managed the tensions between the factions. He strove always to keep the confidence of his boss, the Queen, in that case, but also had the ability to focus with clarity on certain key objectives. I mean, in his case, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. And so again, the analogy is not always exact, but I think some of those attributes work well. And of course, you know, the one measure of Burleigh's success is that he lasted 40 years at the top, and he avoided the fate of one of his recent predecessors, Thomas Cromwell.
On the question of tenure, Kath, how long is the tenure of a cabinet secretary? Are we likely to see Chris Wormald in place for 40 years, or?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, we have seen we've seen moments of high turnover, but largely caused by the particular circumstances in which it operated, or in which that cabinet secretary was there, and obviously the untimely demise of Jeremy Hayward. But we're still up at the sort of 5-year mark, and I think, I mean, if a cabinet secretary only lasts 2 years, given it takes often a year to usher them out the door, that's not a good signal. So, you know, a 5-year period is the amount of time that you probably want to be thinking about, particularly because, you know, for this government, you need somebody who is supporting you through the whole process of starting off post-election to approaching the next general election. So it's definitely a failure if you haven't made that whole political cycle and into the next government, whether it's a government returned or a new government, because, you know, that is incredibly crucial as well. That's the heart of the sort of continuity and so forth. So yeah, you should be easily aiming for a 5-year period. I think a time beyond that these days is pretty unlikely, just because, you know, there is the desire for the refresh, and it is good to get sort of new people in, and it is a hard job to be doing for that amount of time as well.
Alex, I'm going to come to you last. A word about the people who didn't get the job. We know there were other candidates. How hard will it be for them to return to their departments and switch to now working with a new cabinet secretary?
Well, it's a fact of life, isn't it? There's, you know, it's a common experience to go for jobs, not get them, and you've got to suck it up and crack on. I mean, not all of the candidates clearly were inside the system already, so they've got their jobs to carry on with outside. I do think, as I said earlier, it's possible that some of the people will think, well, actually, maybe it's, you know, I fancied a tilt at the top job, and it's you know, I haven't got it, and now it's time to go off and do something a bit different. I suspect most will crack on. They'll be more interested in you know, what follows now. So there will be a bit of sort of feverish, very much kind of inside Whitehall speculation and reflection on where permanent secretaries might move around. Secretaries of State will now have got to know their permanent secretaries and will think, great, this person is fantastic, they're exactly who I need, or actually maybe it's time for a change, time to shift around. I would expect a sort of loosening of the appointments to follow this, and so over the course of the next 6 months, I think we will see a number of new permanent secretary appointments, director general appointments, it kind of filtering out in the in the system. But yeah, basically, sort of, crack on. One of the things, it's an opportunity to talk about this, Wednesday morning colleagues, they call it, well, it was weekly. It's been a bit less than weekly recently, I think. Meetings which I used to sit on the sidelines of, and I won't give away any secrets, but it was always fascinating to see who was talking to who, which corner was the gossip going on. It wasn't really a sort of management meeting in any normal sense, but it was an important kind of coming together of the permanent secretaries across government. And so how Chris Wormald chooses to interact with that, how he sets agendas, the tone he sets, his standing related to all of the other permanent secretaries, the sort of soft power, because as we've said, there aren't that many really strong levers other than appointments for the cabinet secretary to pull. How you stand in that meeting with those colleagues, the tone that you set, how you are able to transact your agenda, the network of relationships that you manage will be really important. So that kind of, the first few WMCs, they're called Wednesday morning colleagues, will be fascinating for those lucky enough to sit in the room.
Thank you, Alex. And unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, so I'm going to have to draw this to a close. Big thank you to Alex, Kath, and especially to David Lidington for joining us. I can see that we've already got some fan mail coming in on the historical CabSec answers, so thanks for those. Many thanks to everyone watching at home for all your brilliant questions. A full recording of the webinar is going to be available to watch on the website, and we'll also be putting up the audio on our podcast feed. In the meantime, do head to the IFG website for all our Cabinet Secretary content. There is definitely lots of it. And see you next time. Thanks.